I don't really have one.
Yeah, so here's the scoop. Again, for those of us who started with video, that don't have jello effect problems and are maybe even a little bigger and heavier than these, the fact that these cameras are so small is actually a liability for handheld shooting, because I shot some handheld stuff for my short, and literally just the pulse of your hand, just even if you're got surgeon's hands, just holding it, especially on a telephoto lens, you're going to see this kind of jitter that having a bigger, heavier camera wouldn't show up. And so, especially if you're using, say, a prime lens that doesn't have image stabilization like the kit lens that comes with it, and it's a telephoto lens, it's just going to magnify this jitter. And if there's any sort of rolling shutter effect going on as well, it all kind of adds up to this kind of weird, jello-y, shaky kind of thing. So you really have to kind of, like get into this Zen mode of like breathing and like trying to.
That's a good description.
Things that have been developed to kind of help that. Yeah. Now this kind of thing, which I think comes from Zacuto, they're like the masters of all this kind of equipment. Now here's the thing though, this thing, it's almost $3,000.
Oh,
so, given that that's more than the camera, I would say that's for a small clientele. So that's the top of the line. So there's something like this, which is called a GorillaPod. Now there's a larger version than that, but I've seen people using that where one of these legs, which can also be used as a great miniature tripod to put on the ground. Yeah. But you can use one to kind of put over your shoulder for kind of a shoulder mount. One of the legs can kind of brace against your chest, and then the other one becomes kind of a pistol grip handle, and you can actually and you can configure it to your own style. But something like that, which is more like $30-40 as opposed to $3,000.
And I didn't buy this for the video camera. I bought it for a still camera.
Yeah.
So there's a longer one that would work better if you could get it out to here, so you could see the.
And these are just cool anyway, because like you could wrap that around this pole, and it's pretty amazing what you can do.
A rock or whatever. Yeah. So that's a way to do it. But like if you notice in that episode of House, they asked the director if they used any stabilization. He said no, not at all. We used let the camera shot it handheld, so it would give a little bit of a handheld feel. And I personally like that feel myself. So I'm happy with that, and I can't wait to get one of these apparatus. I don't think I'm going to get that one, but there's others that you buy it in a kit, and you can configure it for shoulder mount or here or lots of different things. But the thing you're not going to be able to do with these cameras is this kind of thing very well, especially with a long lens on it.
The trick is, go ahead.
What was the thing called? This is a
GorillaPod.
Yeah, pod.
In just camera stores like Cricks or whoever, they have those, and there's a size that's larger than that may be better. The trick too though is, and some of you probably know these people, is if you have friends or other filmmakers who already own this stuff, just either borrow or rent it from them. That's my trick, is instead of spending $3,000 myself, if I only do a shoot every couple months, well, I'll just, hey, let me rent your follow focus and your hand grips and all that stuff. So
there's some pretty inexpensive shoulder mounts out there, which you can mount just about any camera on.
Really?
And also the other one is the Fig Rig, which is
the Fig Rig, which was Mike Figgis, the film director, developed originally for video cameras, but now it seems to work just as well with the still cameras too.
We want to talk about ISO speeds, shutter speed.
I have a little top secret thing that you made. Okay. Well, so when you shoot video, really, if you remember shooting video cameras, there was really sort of a fixed speed of the sensor. There might have been a rated ISO, which is not really appropriate. It's a little different, but basically the camera had one speed in the sense of how light sensitive the imager was. And if you wanted to adjust that, you either adjusted the iris, of course, or the shutter speed to some degree. And if, say, you went outside and there was too much light, that you would maybe have an ND filter, a built-in ND button to kind of knock the light down. So the sort of difference with these DSLRs is that there really are no gain switches like on video cameras. There are no built-in ND filters. You have ISO settings, which is much more like when you shot film and you would buy a certain speed of film rated for a certain ISO. So that the ISO is the light sensitivity of the sensor. So, and you guys, the owners of this camera, you know all this already. The trick is, now there's two things I wanted to talk about. The first one is, when you shoot outside and you've got bright sun, even if you dial down the ISO to say 100, let's say your camera, the lowest it'll go is 100, that may not be dialed down enough to where you're still not overexposing outside and being able to keep the shutter speed that if you're shooting for movies that you want to stay at, which that leads me, I forgot, we need to talk about shutter speeds.
Yeah.
So let me start with shutter speeds, because that's the better way to start. Okay. Shooting 24 frames a second, as film cameras do, the shutter speed of film is 1/48th of a second, and that's because the shutter is open for half that time and closed for half that time. So if you take 24 frames a second, and you cut 1/24th in half, it's 1/48th. So the shutter speed of film is 1/48th of a second. The closest thing you can get on these cameras is a 1/50th setting. So if you're wanting to replicate the shutter speed of film, you could set it to 1/50th, with one caveat though. When you're shooting inside, any kind of fluorescent lighting or anything that runs on house power that's an intermittent light source, since in the United States alternating current runs at 60 hertz, you can get some really weird problems if you shoot at 1/50th inside. So if you're shooting in a room that has fluorescent lights, or if you're using KinoFlow, professional fluorescence, or if you're using HMI lighting, which is an intermittent light source that has a ballast, if you shoot at 1/50th, and I learned this the hard way, you can get flicker. You can get either really annoying flicker that's really apparent, or with HMIs, what you can get is, you'll notice over the course of the clip, your HMI lighting source gets brighter, and then it gets darker, and then and that's because the shutter speed is just slightly different than the speed that the 60 hertz electricity is sort of intermittently flickering the light source. So I would say if you're ever shooting inside, set it to 1/60th, which is the next notch up, and then you should be good to go with any kind of light sources. And that's the default shutter speed that all video cameras were set to before the advent of 24 frame, like the DVX100 and stuff. So just remember, unless you know what you're doing and you're shooting inside, pretty much set it to 1/60th. If you're shooting outside in the sun and you want to get that, be a little more accurate, you can set it to 1/50th. But don't forget to set it back when you go inside, or you might have some problems. Which that's what leads me to ISOs, is that what still photographers will do, of course, outside, if they've got too much light coming in, well, you can just dial down the shutter to say 1/250th or 500th, and every time you up the shutter speed, you're letting less and less light in, so it gets darker. Well, if you do that with and shooting video, you're going to get that stroby Saving Private Ryan staccato look where there's no blur to any imagery at all, which, unless you're going for that effect, doesn't really look film-like at all.
90-degree shutter.
Yeah, so in order to keep your shutter speed at, say, 1/50th, even so, you may dial down to 100 ISO and find, God, it's still too bright. What do I do? You can iris down, but if the whole point is shallow depth of field, the more you iris down, the more depth of field you get. So what do? Well, you have to use neutral density filters, okay, ND filters. And these are filters that are basically like sunglasses for the lens, and they can either be the screw-on type that actually just screw on the filter thread at the front of the lens, or if you do have a matte box like that's on this, it might be a square filter that drops into the filter tray of the matte box, which is one of the main reasons for those things. But there's something that I don't own, and I need to get one, and that's what's called a fader ND. And what this is, it's very cool, if this does what it says it does, is that it's basically a variable density ND filter to where you rotate it, and the more you rotate it, the more neutral density it gives you, so you can actually dial in how much you basically dial in your exposure. So that's really nifty. And I guess it's kind of like two polarizers that you rotate together, and yeah, I need to research it more, but I've heard good things about it, and they're not that expensive. So look, it's called Fader ND, and this, if you're shooting outdoors at all, this is probably a must of some sort. So I don't think they're that expensive. I mean, again, I don't know offhand, but they're not $3,000 like that other thing. I mean, they're definitely. How much? That's totally worth it. Yeah, $100. That's perfect.